German-American relations before 1939 encompassed a dramatic, multi-layered historical arc shaped by migration, cultural interchange, diplomacy, conflict, and ideological confrontation, beginning long before the emergence of a unified German nation-state and culminating in the shadow of global war. From the 18th century onward, German-speaking peoples played an essential role in shaping the American Republic's demographic, cultural, and intellectual landscape. Long before the United States had a coherent foreign policy toward Europe, the foundations of German-American relations were laid not through governments, but through peoples. Immigrants who brought their languages, customs, scientific knowledge, farming traditions, religious practices, and political ideals to a developing continent. Throughout the 19th century, waves of German immigration created some of the largest and most influential ethnic communities in the United States, fostering a transatlantic cultural corridor rooted in music, literature, theology, philosophy, beer-making, craftsmanship, and educational reform. German-language schools, churches, newspapers, and cultural clubs flourished in American cities such as Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Baltimore, making the German presence a distinctive and vibrant element of American life. Meanwhile, German intellectual traditions profoundly shaped American academic culture, as thousands of American scholars studied at prestigious German universities, importing back home the PhD research model, the seminar system, and new scientific paradigms. The United States and the German states also maintained growing trade relations, sharing technologies, agricultural knowledge, and industrial expertise. But as the 19th century progressed and nationalism intensified on both sides of the Atlantic, the relationship grew more complex. Americans admired German culture, yet expressed unease toward Prussian militarism, while Germans celebrated the success of their emigrants, but feared that mass migration might weaken the homeland. Still, until 1914, the relationship was marked more by mutual enrichment than rivalry. This equilibrium collapsed abruptly with the outbreak of World War I, when long-standing cultural bonds were overshadowed by propaganda, espionage scares, submarine warfare, diplomatic scandals, and fierce debates about American neutrality. Germany's invasion of Belgium, the sinking of the Lusitania, and plots involving German agents on American soil fundamentally shifted public opinion. The Zimmermann telegram's proposal of a German-Mexican alliance finally shattered any remaining illusions of goodwill. German Americans, once celebrated as model immigrants, faced suspicion, cultural suppression, and sometimes violence. German-language schools closed, newspapers struggled, and cultural traditions went underground. In Germany, the United States' late entry into the war contributed to the collapse of the German Empire and shaped post-war resentment. After the armistice, both nations confronted the challenge of rebuilding diplomatic and economic connections under the radically new circumstances of the Weimar Republic, a fragile democracy born from defeat, revolution, and economic collapse. During the 1920s, the United States emerged as Germany's most important financial partner, providing massive loans through the Dawes and Young plans that stabilized the German currency and fueled a period of cultural and industrial rebirth known as the Golden Twenties. American banks, philanthropies, and corporations became deeply involved in German affairs, while German art, cinema, architecture, and scholarship regained influence in America. Diplomacy between Washington and Berlin warmed as leaders such as Gustav Stresemann sought reconciliation and international cooperation. But beneath this renewed partnership lay unresolved tensions. Many Americans continued to associate Germany with the memory of wartime aggression, while Germans viewed American investment as intrusive or exploitative. The Weimar Republic's political instability and reliance on foreign loans left it vulnerable, a fragility exposed when the Great Depression struck in 1929. As American credit evaporated, Germany's economy collapsed, fueling mass unemployment, social disorder, and political radicalization. Extremist parties, especially the Nazis, capitalized on public discontent, denouncing both the Versailles Treaty and foreign influence, especially the perceived dominance of American finance. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the trajectory of German-American relations changed irrevocably. The United States watched with growing concern as the Nazi regime dismantled democracy, persecuted political opponents, purged universities, and enacted increasingly harsh anti-Jewish laws. American diplomats reported the rapid transformation of German society, while journalists and intellectuals raised alarms about fascism's rise. Although economic ties persisted and formal diplomacy continued, the moral and ideological gulf between the nations widened dramatically. German Americans, still recovering from wartime hostility, felt deep discomfort as the Nazi government claimed to speak on behalf of all ethnic Germans, complicating their identity and place within American society. Cultural and academic exchange dwindled as Nazi ideology permeated public life in Germany, driving many leading thinkers into exile, many of whom found new homes in American universities, influencing American understanding of the Nazi threat. Inside the United States, isolationism remained strong, but public opinion turned increasingly negative as Hitler pursued rearmament, territorial expansion, and racial persecution. Events such as the Nuremberg Laws, the Berlin Olympics, and Kristallnacht made Nazi brutality impossible to ignore. President Franklin D. Roosevelt began warning publicly of the dangers posed by aggressive dictatorships, and though the United States maintained official neutrality, it increasingly aligned with the enemies of Nazi Germany. By the late 1930s, diplomatic relations were strained, cultural ties severed, and mutual suspicion dominant. Germany viewed the United States as a decadent democracy controlled by racial inferiors and capitalist elites, while Americans saw Germany as a totalitarian aggressor threatening world stability. German-American relations before 1914 were shaped by a deep and evolving web of cultural, economic, intellectual, and political exchanges. From the founding of the United States to the outbreak of the First World War, the story of German-American engagement was above all a story of people. Millions of migrants who carried their languages, customs, skills, and aspirations across the Atlantic. These human connections produced a relationship that predated modern diplomacy, grounded instead in shared experiences and mutual curiosity. It was a relationship less defined by treaties and government strategy than by schools, churches, immigration networks, scientific academies, business ties, and the accumulated presence of German-speaking communities across the American continent. As these communities grew, so too did the influence of German culture on America's developing identity. This chapter examines that long arc, tracing the intricate and often overlooked foundations of German-American ties from 1776 through the early 20th century. The earliest phase of this relationship began even before the establishment of the United States. German-speaking immigrants, particularly from regions such as the Palatine, Baden, Württemberg, and Saxony, arrived in North America throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Many came seeking religious freedom, escaping economic hardship, or fleeing political instability. Others were artisans, farmers, and intellectuals drawn to the promise of land and opportunity. By the time of the Revolutionary War, German settlers already formed significant communities in Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, and various frontier regions. Their presence was influential enough that the Continental Congress even debated printing documents in German to ensure wide communication among the colony's residents. German Americans fought in the Revolutionary War, farmed the land, and established thriving towns, gradually embedding themselves into the social fabric of the young nation. In the decades following independence, the German presence in America expanded rapidly. Immigrants brought advanced farming techniques, viticulture knowledge, educational models, and a strong tradition of communal and religious organization. Many founded Lutheran, Reformed, and Moravian congregations that would become central to cultural life in early American towns. German-language newspapers appeared in cities across the Northeast and Midwest, facilitating political debate and preserving linguistic heritage. The intellectual exchange was also notable. American thinkers admired the universities of Göttingen, Heidelberg, and Berlin, and many sought to adapt German educational principles for the growing republic. This era saw not only the movement of people, but the movement of ideas, with German philosophy, theology, and science leaving an imprint on early American institutions. Mass migration from the German states accelerated dramatically in the 19th century. Between 1820 and 1914, more than 5 million German immigrants arrived in the United States, making them one of the largest immigrant groups of the era. Their motivations were as diverse as the migrants themselves. Some sought economic opportunity as industrialization reshaped European labor markets. Others fled crop failures or political repression, particularly after the failed revolutions of 1848. Many of these 48ers were politically engaged liberals and Democrats who carried with them a strong belief in constitutional rights, free speech, and civic participation. They became influential voices in American politics, journalism, and education, establishing a legacy that helped shape the American democratic tradition. Their activism energized movements for public education, abolitionism, and social reform, illustrating the significant impact German immigrants had on national development. German communities maintained robust cultural identities even as they adapted to American life. They founded Turnverein, gymnastics and civic associations, Schützingverein, marksman clubs, singing societies, breweries, fraternal organizations, and cultural festivals. These institutions helped immigrants preserve customs while fostering bonds with other Americans who were eager to explore the richness of German culture. German food, music, and holiday traditions became widely adopted. The Christmas tree, kindergarten model, and many musical traditions, such as community choral groups, were all examples of German practices integrated into American society. In cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Baltimore, German language and culture were not simply ethnic enclaves, but part of the mainstream urban landscape. As German Americans grew in number and influence, so too did the economic interactions between Germany and the United States. American farmers, manufacturers, and merchants engaged in trade with German ports such as Hamburg and Bremen, two of the busiest commercial hubs in Europe. German industrial goods, chemicals, machinery, and precision instruments found eager customers in the United States, while American agricultural products and raw materials flowed in the opposite direction. German banks and business networks played a role in financing American railroads and industrial projects. German scientists and engineers contributed expertise that influenced American manufacturing, chemistry, and research institutions. Even many American entrepreneurs traveled to German industrial centers to study production methods and technological advancements. The intellectual world formed yet another bridge between the two nations. 19th-century American universities often modeled their curricula and organizational structures on German institutions. The PhD degree, seminar teaching style, and emphasis on specialized research were imported from German traditions. Many prominent American scholars studied in Berlin, Leipzig, or Heidelberg before returning to establish leading academic departments in the United States. German literature, music, and philosophy, especially the works of Goethe, Schiller, Kant, and Hegel, were widely translated and taught. American orchestras and conservatories were deeply shaped by German conductors and instructors. Even American religious institutions were influenced by German biblical criticism, theology, and seminary education. Despite these strong cultural and intellectual connections, official diplomatic relations between Germany and the United States developed more slowly. The fragmented nature of the German states before unification in 1871 made bilateral diplomacy less centralized. Individual states such as Prussia, Bavaria, and Baden maintained separate diplomatic missions. After unification under the German Empire, relations became more formalized, though still heavily influenced by the large German-American population. In many ways, German Americans acted as unofficial ambassadors, shaping American views of Germany and advocating for friendly relations. But as the century progressed, growing nationalism, both in Europe and the United States, introduced new complexities into the relationship. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked a decisive turning point in German-American relations, shattering a century of cultural affinity, economic connectivity, and shared intellectual admiration almost overnight. For decades, Americans had viewed Germany through the lens of immigrants, scholars, and artisans who brought traditions of music, philosophy, education, and craftsmanship to the United States. German Americans had become one of the most well-integrated and influential ethnic groups in the nation, and their cultural institutions, from churches and newspapers to beer halls, singing societies, and Turnvereine, were deeply embedded in the urban and rural fabric of American life. Yet the war would transform these long-standing bonds into sources of tension, suspicion, and hostility. Propaganda, espionage scares, diplomatic blunders, and evolving American national identity all contributed to the unraveling of trust between the two countries. By the time hostilities ceased in 1918, German-American relations had been remade by conflict, leaving deep scars that would shape the decades that followed. When war erupted in Europe in July 1914, the United States initially sought to maintain neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson declared that Americans must remain impartial in thought as well as in action, a statement intended not only to guide national policy, but also to calm the internal divisions created by America's diverse population. Millions of Americans trace their roots to Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while millions more had ties to Britain, Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe. The war threatened to divide communities along ethnic lines, and American leaders feared that intervening too quickly, or appearing biased, might inflame domestic tensions. Neutrality, therefore, became both a diplomatic stance and a social necessity, at least in the early years of the conflict. Despite America's efforts to remain neutral, Germany's initial military actions generated mixed reactions across the United States. Some Americans admired Germany's efficiency, discipline, and scientific prowess, which appeared to reflect the same qualities that had produced so many successful German-American communities. Others, however, reacted with concern as German armies marched through Belgium in a strategy designed to outflank France quickly. Reports of German atrocities, many exaggerated or fabricated by British propagandists, captured American headlines. Graphic stories of Belgian civilians being murdered, churches burned, and cultural landmarks destroyed struck a chord in a nation that identified strongly with democratic values and humanitarian ideals. Even before the United States entered the war, the rape of Belgium became one of the most influential narratives shaping American perceptions of Germany, marking the first major rupture in German-American goodwill. British propaganda played a central role in influencing American attitudes. Britain had deep cultural, linguistic, and economic ties to the United States, and its mastery of global communication networks allowed it to shape the international narrative of the war. British officials circulated stories highlighting German militarism and alleged barbarity, knowing they would resonate in a country whose political identity was built on republicanism and suspicion of autocratic power. With cable lines, newspapers, and diplomatic envoys working in concert, the British shaped American opinion far more effectively than the Germans, who struggled to counteract these efforts due to diplomatic constraints, internal disorganization, and the inherent credibility challenges faced by wartime propaganda. Germany's attempts to influence American opinion often backfired. German diplomats and intelligence agents engaged in covert operations designed to disrupt Allied supply lines, sabotage factories, and promote pro-German sentiment. Some of these actions were clumsy and exposed, fueling sensational headlines. The most infamous incidents included plots to destroy ammunition depots, bombs placed on cargo ships, and conspiracies to incite labor strikes. While many of these operations were exaggerated or misunderstood, their revelation created a widespread perception that Germany sought to undermine American neutrality. The image of the German spy working secretly in American cities became a powerful cultural trope that heightened public anxiety and eroded sympathy for Germany's position. The situation worsened in 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger liner torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 passengers died, including 128 Americans. The incident shocked the American public and transformed the debate about neutrality. Germany defended its actions by pointing to the ship's cargo of munitions, arguing that it was a legitimate military target. Yet this nuance was lost in the wave of outrage that swept the United States. The sinking was portrayed as evidence of Germany's disregard for civilian life and international norms. American newspapers published dramatic accounts of drowning families, abandoned lifeboats, and the cruel logic of submarine warfare. Public opinion shifted dramatically, and German Americans found themselves pressured to denounce the attack publicly or risk being viewed as unpatriotic. Tensions escalated further as Germany continued its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The German leadership believed that severing Britain's supply lines was essential to winning the war quickly, even if it risked provoking the United States. American ships were damaged or sunk, and warnings from Berlin went unheeded in Washington. Germany attempted to mitigate diplomatic fallout by offering promises to restrict submarine activity, but these were inconsistently enforced. Each new sinking brought new outrage and put pressure on President Wilson to act. American businesses, deeply tied to international trade, began to view Germany as a threat to commercial stability. Meanwhile, American banks and industries increasingly supplied the Allies with loans, weapons, and raw materials, further entangling the United States economically with the British war effort. The Zimmermann telegram of 1917 marked a decisive moment in the collapse of German-American relations. Sent by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, the secret message proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico should the United States enter the war. In return, Mexico would be promised the recovery of lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When British intelligence intercepted and released the telegram, it ignited outrage across the United States. To many Americans, it confirmed suspicions that Germany sought to threaten the nation directly and destabilize its borders. It shattered any remaining hopes among German diplomats that they could maintain American neutrality. It also undermined German-American communities, who faced accusations of disloyalty and conspiracy despite having no involvement in the affair. As diplomatic tensions rose, the domestic situation for German Americans grew increasingly fraught. Once celebrated for their contributions to American culture, German immigrants now found themselves targets of suspicion, hostility, and sometimes outright violence. Schools eliminated German language instruction. Newspapers were forced to switch to English or shut down entirely, and cultural organizations disbanded under social pressure. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage, dachshunds were mocked as Liberty Dogs, and orchestras removed German composers from their programs. While some of these actions appear comical in retrospect, they reflected a deeper atmosphere of paranoia and cultural suppression. German Americans, who had previously been embraced as model immigrants, were suddenly compelled to prove their loyalty to a nation that questioned their identity. The U.S. government contributed to this climate through legislation and enforcement actions aimed at rooting out perceived threats. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 gave authorities broad powers to monitor, censor, and prosecute individuals suspected of undermining the war effort. German language materials were scrutinized, and many German-born residents were required to register as enemy aliens. Several thousand were interned in government camps despite lacking evidence of wrongdoing. The legal framework of wartime repression had long-lasting consequences not only for German Americans, but also for civil liberties in the United States more broadly. Historians later noted that fear, rather than genuine security threats, drove many of these actions. The end of the First World War left German-American relations in a state of profound uncertainty. Years of propaganda, suspicion, and wartime repression had severed the deep cultural and social bonds that once connected the two nations. German-American communities, once celebrated for their contributions to American society, emerged from the conflict weakened, fragmented, and frequently stigmatized. In Germany, defeat, revolution, and economic collapse created an atmosphere of trauma and disillusionment. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the establishment of the Weimar Republic signaled a dramatic political transformation, but one that occurred amid chaos and widespread resentment. Against this turbulent backdrop, Germany and the United States entered a new era, one defined not by romantic cultural ties or unchecked hostility, but by cautious diplomacy, economic interdependence, and complex political calculations. The years from 1919 to 1933 formed a transitional period in which both countries grappled with the legacies of war while exploring the possibility of renewed cooperation. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States found itself in an unusual position. Though a late entrant to the conflict, its military, financial, and industrial contributions had given it significant influence at the post-war negotiating table. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe with his vision of a new global order shaped by democratic principles, self-determination, and collective security through the League of Nations. Many Germans initially viewed Wilson's 14 points with cautious optimism, seeing them as a more generous alternative to the harsh terms demanded by Britain and France. However, the Treaty of Versailles ultimately disappointed these hopes. The treaty imposed punitive reparations on Germany, redrew borders, reduced the military to a symbolic force, and assigned blame for the war to Germany alone. For many Germans, this settlement was a bitter humiliation, and the United States, despite Wilson's intentions, was associated with the punitive peace process simply by virtue of its presence at the negotiations. Ironically, the United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. Domestic opposition led Congress to reject the agreement, preventing American membership in the League of Nations and leaving the country diplomatically detached from Europe. This decision shaped future relations in profound ways. By declining to join the League, the United States positioned itself outside the emerging system of collective security and post-war reconstruction. Yet America remained deeply involved in Europe through private finance, industrial investment, and diplomacy. This ambiguous posture, simultaneously distant from European politics, yet economically indispensable, created a paradoxical environment in which German-American relations would be rebuilt not through formal alliances, but through business ties, debt negotiations, and cultural exchange. The early Weimar period was marked by severe economic crisis, political extremism, and widespread social upheaval. Hyperinflation devastated the German currency, wiping out savings, destabilizing the middle class, and creating a sense of national emergency. As the German mark collapsed and the government struggled to meet reparation payments, many Germans blamed the Allies, the Versailles Treaty, and the democratic leaders who appeared unable to stabilize the situation. The United States, though not formally part of the treaty structure, played a crucial role in shaping Weimar's economic recovery. American bankers, economists, and political leaders increasingly recognized that Europe's stability, and by extension the global economy, depended on Germany's ability to recover. As a result, American involvement in German economic affairs grew steadily throughout the 1920s. The Dawes Plan of 1924 represented a turning point in German-American relations. Negotiated by an international committee, but strongly influenced by American financial expertise, the plan restructured Germany's reparation payments, stabilized the currency, and facilitated a massive influx of American loans into the German economy. American banks, eager to invest in foreign markets, poured hundreds of millions of dollars into German industry, infrastructure, and government bonds. For several years, this inflow of capital helped fuel a remarkable, if fragile, period of economic recovery known as the Golden Twenties. Berlin's cultural scene flourished, factories resumed production, and new technological innovations spread across the country. Though Germany remained deeply indebted to the United States, the arrangement created a mutually beneficial cycle. American banks profited from interest payments, German businesses modernized, and European reparations became more manageable. Diplomatically, the 1920s offered opportunities for reconciliation as well. The appointment of experienced diplomats such as Gustav Stresemann in Germany and a series of capable U.S. ambassadors in Berlin helped foster an atmosphere of cooperation. Stresemann, serving first as chancellor and later as foreign minister, sought to rehabilitate Germany's reputation on the world stage through pragmatic diplomacy. He recognized that improving relations with the United States was essential not only for economic recovery, but also for re-establishing Germany as a respected member of the international community. Under his guidance, Germany pursued agreements such as the Locarno Treaties of 1925, which normalized borders in Western Europe and reduced fears of renewed conflict. Although the United States was not a signatory, American policymakers quietly supported initiatives that promoted stability and economic growth. Cultural and academic exchanges also resumed during the Weimar years, though not at the level seen before World War I. German universities, long admired by American scholars, continued to attract students and researchers, especially in fields such as physics, mathematics, and philosophy. Figures like Albert Einstein became global icons whose ideas resonated on both sides of the Atlantic. American philanthropies, including the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Endowment, funded scientific research and social programs in Germany, reflecting a belief that cultural engagement could promote democratic values and international understanding. German artists, filmmakers, and writers influenced American culture during this period as well. Expressionist cinema, Bauhaus architecture, and modernist literature found enthusiastic audiences in American intellectual circles, helping to rebuild cultural connections damaged by wartime hostility. The rise of the Nazi regime in 1933 transformed German-American relations in ways that neither nation had fully anticipated. The fragile camaraderie built during the Weimar years, through loans, diplomacy, cultural exchanges, and cautious optimism, collapsed rapidly as Adolf Hitler consolidated power and reshaped Germany into a totalitarian state driven by racial ideology, militarism, and sweeping political repression. For the United States, this period was marked by deepening concern, moral ambivalence, domestic debates over foreign policy, and increasing awareness that Germany was once again becoming a destabilizing force in world affairs. Between 1933 and the outbreak of war in 1939, the transatlantic relationship shifted from wary observation to outright hostility, shaped by clashing values, diplomatic confrontations, and profoundly different visions of global order. When Hitler assumed the chancellorship in January 1933, many Americans initially viewed the development as an internal German matter rather than a threat to international stability. News of political violence, book burnings, and purges within the government reached the United States, but public perception was mixed and sometimes clouded by misinformation. Some observers minimized the dangers, interpreting the Nazi movement as a temporary reaction to economic collapse. Others, including journalists, diplomats, and scholars familiar with Germany, warned that the new regime represented a radical departure from the democratic aspirations of the Weimar era. For German Americans who had spent the previous decade attempting to distance themselves from the memory of World War I, the emergence of a nationalist dictatorship created a new source of discomfort and internal division. American diplomatic officials stationed in Berlin were among the first to raise alarms about Nazi policies. Reports from the U.S. Embassy described escalating violence against political opponents, suppression of civil liberties, and the rapid dismantling of democratic institutions. The treatment of Jews, which began with boycotts, discriminatory laws, and social ostracism, shocked many American observers who recognized the ideological extremism at the core of Hitler's movement. Despite these disturbing developments, early U.S. policy toward Nazi Germany remained cautious and restrained. The Roosevelt administration, focused primarily on domestic recovery from the Great Depression, avoided taking strong positions on foreign developments unless they threatened American strategic interests. The Nazi regime, for its part, approached relations with the United States with a mixture of opportunism and suspicion. On the one hand, Hitler recognized that Germany could not afford confrontation with the United States during its period of rearmament and political consolidation. German diplomats, therefore, attempted to maintain cordial formal relations, seeking trade agreements and cultural exchanges that might soften international criticism. On the other hand, Nazi ideology viewed the United States as a racially mixed, materialistic society inferior to Germany's Aryan civilization. Nazi propaganda routinely criticized American democracy, capitalism, and multiculturalism, portraying the United States as a flawed model incompatible with Germany's authoritarian vision. These contradictory impulses shaped German foreign policy throughout the 1930s, creating a strained but persistent diplomatic relationship. Trade relations formed one of the more stable components of German-American interaction during this era. Despite political tensions, economic ties remained significant. Germany sought imports of raw materials such as cotton, petroleum, and machinery, while the United States exported industrial goods, chemicals, and agricultural products. American corporations, including companies in the automotive, chemical, and electrical sectors, continued to maintain subsidiaries or partnerships in Germany, drawn by commercial opportunities and long-standing industrial relationships. Critics later argued that these business ties sometimes obscured the extent of Nazi abuses or delayed stronger American denunciations of the regime. Supporters countered that economic engagement provided a channel for communication and potential influence, even as political relations deteriorated. However, cultural and educational exchanges between the two nations suffered greatly under Nazi rule. German universities, once admired as global centers of scholarship, were purged of Jewish professors, dissenting intellectuals, and politically suspect students. American scholars who had previously studied or taught in Germany now encountered restrictions, ideological pressure, and racial policies that made academic collaboration increasingly untenable. Many prominent German intellectuals fled the country, seeking refuge in the United States and other Western nations. Figures such as Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt, and Thomas Mann brought with them first-hand accounts of Nazi oppression, shaping American understanding of the regime's true nature. Their presence enriched American academic and cultural life while contributing to growing criticism of Nazi Germany within U.S. intellectual circles. Public opinion in the United States during the 1930s was far from unified. Isolationism remained a powerful force, particularly among Americans who believed that involvement in World War I had been a catastrophic mistake driven by economic interests rather than national necessity. Influential groups such as the America First Committee lobbied for strict neutrality in foreign conflicts, arguing that the United States should avoid entanglements in European affairs. At the same time, grassroots organizations, religious leaders, journalists, and immigrant communities urged Americans to confront the moral dangers posed by fascism and totalitarianism. Newspapers published accounts of anti-Jewish violence, political repression, and the militarization of German society, gradually shifting public sentiment toward greater concern. The Nazi regime's treatment of Jewish people became a central point of tension. Anti-Semitic policies escalated steadily throughout the 1930s, moving from social exclusion to legal discrimination, economic dispossession, and well-orchestrated violence. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship and restricted nearly every aspect of their lives. These developments alarmed many Americans, particularly Jewish organizations and civil rights groups, who urged the U.S. government to speak out more forcefully. However, the United States' own immigration policies, shaped by restrictive quotas and widespread economic insecurity, limited its willingness to accept refugees. The tragic gap between American moral condemnation and practical assistance became one of the defining ethical dilemmas of the era. The 1936 Berlin Olympics highlighted the contradictions of German-American relations on the eve of war. The Nazi regime viewed the Games as an opportunity to showcase a sanitized image of Germany to the world, temporarily removing anti-Jewish signs and suppressing visible expressions of bigotry. Some Americans advocated boycotting the Games, arguing that participation would legitimize the regime's ideology. Others insisted that sport should remain separate from politics. Ultimately, the United States chose to participate, and the Games proceeded with great international fanfare. Yet, even as the spectacle unfolded, the underlying realities of Nazi oppression remained unchanged. For some American observers, the participation decision symbolized the broader struggle between diplomatic caution and moral responsibility.